David Gate, welcome to the show, man. How are you today?
I'm really good, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, man, really excited. It's kind of funny, the subject of our conversation today. It's like we're two guys that are going to talk about the black church, and I'm excited for that. I think much needed discussion around some of this. Neither of us are historians,
No.
so we're just going to sort of wrestle through some of this. But I think we're both curious.
Yeah.
We're both interested in just getting to the heart of the matter.
hmm
And so I'm excited to talk about this. For our listeners, David wrote an article recently on his Substack. And the title is, get ready for this, everybody, How White Charismatic Worship Stole from the Black Church, the Vampires Who Steal Stories and Songs and Culture. That's bold. And for context, really that title can fully be understood
Yeah.
based upon a movie,
hmm
right? Ryan Coogler's Sinners
Yeah.
movie, which I've seen, you've obviously
Yeah.
seen, and we can dive into that. But what I wanted to start with, David, was just your reaction to the movie as you saw it in the theater,
hmm
just how it hit you at the outset.
I mean, it's a incredibly moving, powerful movie. Like, it's not just like an emotional movie. It's full of action and drama, and a few jump scares, and so it's a really hard hitting piece of art. It's phenomenal. And just like any piece of art, you kind of filter it through your life and experiences. And so, um, one of the premises of the movie is that there is a young blues singer called Sammy who, when he sings, it stirs the spirit, and it connects to the ancestors, both past and present. And there is a vampire called Remick, a white vampire, an Irish white vampire, who wants that power. And that's the kind of conceit of the movie. And so he goes after this young bluesman. And, I filtered that through my experiences of life and church and what I have learned in the last 10, 15 years about the streams of church and worship that I came from, which is in the UK, the charismatic Anglican world. So an organization called Soul Survivor, another organization called New Wine. They were kind of two where I was really growing up in. But over the years, we were heavily influenced by the Vineyard Church, and also in later years Bethel and Hillsong and things like that as well. And so I
Yep.
kind of saw this movie, and the way it plays out with this vampire that wants the stories and the songs and the culture, but does not want liberation, but wants to own it and possess it and assimilate it. And I kind of saw a parallel to the church world that I grew up in and that I've been a part of.
Yeah, it's interesting, David, because I read your article before I saw the movie. So the entire time I was watching the movie, I was thinking about your article, which I wonder if I would have come to those conclusions without having read what you
Yeah.
wrote. Maybe I would have, I'm not sure. But the movie is unbelievable. It's almost like two halves.
Mm.
Like the first half is just this southern kind of historical. There were a couple moments where I teared up,
Yeah.
you know, hearing the singing and the music and just observing the injustice and suffering of Southern black culture.
hmm
And then there's this, I don't want to give away too much of a spoiler, but like halfway through the movie shifts into this like gothic vampire
Yeah.
experience. And really unbelievable. Like that scene in the juke joint where the music
Yeah.
just takes off and there's all these historical from different eras of black
Mm.
music. I was like just blown away and I can't wait to see it again. But David, there seems to be, at least what I'm experiencing when it comes to issues of race in the evangelical church today, there's a couple of views. One is like erasure,
hmm
where it's almost like this either didn't happen or we just want to pretend like it didn't happen. Let's all move on. And the other side is sort of this, we can't talk about things like this anymore
Mm.
because it disrupts the unity.
Yeah.
And I just find, I hear this all the time. even with some of the interviews that I'm having, content that I'm creating, is why are you trying to bring so much disunity? And I just know for me, talking about these things, it humbles me. I feel like it brings me closer to God, closer to his heart. Can you talk about just that dynamic of racism today and why it's so difficult for us to face this?
I think one of the reasons why it's so hard is because I think as individuals, we need the kind of security blanket of feeling that the kind of streams and movements and denominations and churches that we grew up in, and maybe you changed course at some point in your life, or certainly the ones that we're in right now, are ones that are good, and the ones that do good and have been based on right principles, right actions, because we don't like to think that perhaps the streams in which we've come from have perhaps stolen from other streams and taken. And it's actually ridiculous to think that they haven't, because of the way America is and how much of black life and culture, black bodies, black work has been stolen and appropriated in American history. It's more than you can document. So to think that the church hasn't done that, or to think that your particular wing of the church hasn't done that, it is really, I think, quite naive and probably lacks a little honesty, critique, and truthfulness, really, to pursue that thought that, okay, so what in my world and what in my worship practice, what in my ecclesiological outlook and is taken from other parts without credit and without concern for the people that it's taken from. Yeah,
Absolutely. There's a book I'm reading right now, David. I don't know if you've read this. Have you read The Black Church?
I have not. No.
Okay, The Black Church by Henry Louis Gates Jr. I'm actually surprised you haven't read this, because it's almost like your article shares a lot of what's said in here, which is fascinating. But I wanted to read this because I just found this little paragraph interesting. In the early days of the phonograph, right? This is like early 20th century. The early days of the phonograph, jazz and blues recordings made by African-American artists were marketed as race records, and black people lined up to purchase them. No genre was more popular than religious race records. When you had migrants going into these congregations, they weren't hearing a familiar sound, and the record companies took advantage of that by packaging and then selling this Southern revivalistic sensibility captured on wax. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's
like
what it
how
is.
it's sort of this lack of care and concern and appreciation for the human, but only caring about the music and the art and how to sort of capitalize on that for our own gain. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, but there's another layer that makes it even worse, which is that music and the art, particularly of the blues, is born out of suffering. And, black spirituals, it is all born out of suffering and slavery and Jim Crow. And so when you have this music and this art that is born out of suffering and then taken by wealthy white people and then sold, and they make enormous profit on it, is, it's more than problematic. It's just wrong. It's evil. The part of this conversation is the history of music, not just the history of the church. And so how various genres were racialized, and so blues and jazz was black music, and country and bluegrass became white music in the South, even though the origins of all of those were at various points mixed. And there were a lot of black musicians that influenced early country and bluegrass. And I've listened to a bunch of the recordings from like the 1920s and 30s. And you can't tell who's white and who's black a lot of the time, because they're all just singing in, kind of working class, poor Southern accents. And equally, there were white people around in the birth of the blues too, But when the music industry was born, it was racialized, the genres were racialized, and they were separated, and all that kind of innocence in the creation of a thing then gets robbed, and it gets sold basically for profit. And I mean, you can trace basically every genre of American music has its origins in black music. The only thing that really doesn't is the folk music that is derived from Irish and English and European settlers. Everything else pretty much, is either directly from black music or heavily influenced and taken from black music.
So it's pretty naive to deny what you're saying just based on the fact that it's not just worship music that has sort of appropriated and stolen. It's music. American music in general.
Yeah.
I want to just... Your article is it's so well written. It's cutting. It hurts. A lot of people are going to be offended by it. I'm personally just really challenged by it. I read it. I'm like, oh my gosh, what can I do better in my small corner of the world to just be a little different? Yeah. I'm just going to read your article back to you in some ways and just have you comment on it. But you say the white charismatic worship, by which I mean the vast, tangled, contradictory phenomena of emotionally performative, musically semi-competent, come-as-you-are evangelical rock, owes its very soul to the black church. And not in a we were inspired by kind of way, in this vampire will devour the power of the blues kind of way. So you're going to have to see the movie, which probably a lot of our listeners might be pretty uncomfortable with the movie. It's intense. But anyway, theft repackaged as innovation. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think so much of creativity, and if you're a creative person, you know this to be true. It is taking one thing from one place, one thing from another place, and making something new, right? That's a big part of creating. And so in some ways, it's a natural part of the process that you might hear black music, or you might hear, black stories and songs and be inspired by that and want to take some of that and add it to your own. In some ways, the genesis of that is actually very good and, open-minded and curious, all things that I think are really helpful. But, you cannot remove yourself from the context of America, which is the constant stealing of black work and art and ideas and labor by white people to make money. And so if you're going to do that, if you're going to be inspired, and if you're going to look to blues or gospel, and really in terms of the streams that I come from, like the charismatic world, heavily influenced by black Pentecostalism. Yes. But I was never taught that. I was taught that John Wimber came up with all of this in the late 70s and had no frame of mind or concept that, speaking in tongues as a practice, or prophecy as a practice, or that the kind of intimate, spending a long time in the presence of God practices were not invented in Orange County in 1970 something. That they had a long history, particularly the gifts of the Spirit, speaking and singing in tongues and prophecy and so forth. These are things that were held up by the African church for centuries, when the Western church was not doing it, when Catholicism was not doing it, when Puritanism was not doing it, when, the Anglican church, find a stream, it was not doing these things. Where these things were done were in African churches. And when they were then stolen, literally, from the land and brought here as slaves, then they had their new roots in America. And, in the same way that America tends to do, over the course of time, begins to say, oh no, we like this makes us feel good, so we'll take it now, we'll keep it, and that will be our innovation, that will be our revival, that will be our renewal of the Spirit, and just all those kind of language that we use to kind of talk about something new and innovative, but is really a theft. It's more than a borrowing. It's more than just being inspired. They've been doing this for centuries, and suddenly we've discovered it. Like, no, it's really wrong, in my view.
Yeah, it's interesting when you study the Black Church. So in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Black Church was known as the invisible institution, right? It was a safe place for African Americans to express themselves, because anywhere else that you went, you were not safe. You could be lynched at any moment. And so the invisible institution was created as a sort of safe place for Black culture and Black music and art to really thrive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just interesting to me how something like speaking in tongues, when, I don't know, help me unpack this, because I feel like historically, when white people would see speaking in tongues in a Black context, it was almost criticized, or called demonic, or the stigma associated with being Black. But then all of a sudden, white people are rolling around on the ground speaking in tongues, and all of a sudden, like you say, it's revival.
It's a move of the Spirit. Yeah.
But in the Black church, it's not a move of the Spirit.
Yeah.
It's just,
no. I mean, it's really hard because in the 90s there was the Toronto Blessing, which was hugely influential. There was a genuine move of God in the Toronto Airport Church. It had a huge influence in the UK.
I remember that.
And was it God? Yeah. I don't think it wasn't God, but viewed it as something we had discovered, and we viewed it as something that just spontaneously happened and had no other roots or connections to history. And so what you end up doing, totally, I was a teenager, I was 15, 16 when this stuff was happening, so I had no idea about anything. But what you end up doing is you end up erasing the Black history, the long, centuries-long Black history.
Struggle.
Yeah, and an enormous struggle as well. You erase it by saying, oh, this was just a move of God that spontaneously happened. You're trying to remove things that have happened for centuries and claim them as your own, and claim them as new, and claim them as a move of God that is specific and spontaneous. But it is not new. It is actually something that has happened in the Black church for centuries.
Yep. Well, and what makes it even more grotesque is, I agree with you. I think God moved in those spaces. I think of Brownsville too, that happened a few years later. We don't have to debate whether that was God or not. But what you have is these sort of religious entrepreneurs sweeping into those contexts and sort of capitalizing on this move of God, this opportunity to market and to create and to generate enormous wealth. I think, like the Asbury revival from a few years ago, I think that was interesting in that the leaders of whatever was happening there, they weren't letting people in who wanted to come in and sort of capitalize on this moment for sort of monetary profit or gain. But whereas like in revivals in American history, you can sort of see this, here's an opportunity for us to profit. And I don't know if that's intentional or just a byproduct of the system. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult in American life to kind of separate that kind of love for the dollar, that love for the celebrity, from genuine intentions. I just think they're all wrapped up in what it means to be American, really.
Something else you say, David, music is not an accessory to worship. It is worship. This is interesting to me because I agree with you. When you look at the history of the Black church, there's something about worship that it's prophetic, it's performative. It's this incredible talent that is speaking on our behalf. And I think there's a side to justice that the white church just doesn't understand. Like for us, and I've said this a lot of times, worship is not a performance, right? It's all about God.
Yeah.
It's not about performing. And I think in a white context, that makes sense. What are we doing? But in a black context, it feels like the performance itself is an act of worship, not just sort of a means to an end.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that?
Well, my observation, I'm not an expert on this at all, but my observation would be in how it would be the difference between how white and black cultures perceive human individuals and human dignity in connection to community. So, in my experience in black cultures, to see someone ripping off great riffs, vocal riffs, seeing someone just absolutely shred, seeing someone on an amazing drum solo, seeing the whole band just absolutely lock in and destroy the room, is a communal experience.
Yes.
And is, seeing someone reach the heights of excellence is a communal experience. And it is viewed and received and taken that way. When those things happen in white context, they are celebrity experiences. And so it becomes, because the way that, white spaces operate is incredibly hierarchical and patriarchal. And so what that does is it seeks to elevate the individual that's performing to unholy lengths, unholy heights of celebrity, right? And so, not that celebrity doesn't exist in the black church too, it's just a lot more complex and nuanced, but very much in white scenarios, this is what we do, we elevate. And so what we tend to do is, because we want it to be about God and not an individual, unless that individual's the preacher, but we don't want it to be about, an individual. And so then in our rhetoric, we tone it down, and then we kind of just excuse a certain mediocre level of musicianship, a certain mediocre level of vocal ability generally. Basically, it's an assimilation. It's trying to get everything to be homogenous within the white spaces. And so that kind of individual flair is not looked on as good, because we're constantly trying to assimilate and make homogenous.
It's almost like in the black church, you look at an incredible performance and you say, this is us.
Yeah.
Right? But in white spaces, we look at that and we worship the celebrity on the stage. Yeah. We don't see ourselves in that story. Our story is, this is our leader, our celebrity, and we adore them. It all comes back to the history. The black church, the history, the suffering, the pain, the injustice informs their worldview. It permeates their art, their singing, their vocal tone, the run. All of it is tied to history. That is a fascinating topic. I don't even know where else to go with it, but
one of the things that prompted from my article that people were saying was like, well, what do we do? Do we just stop singing this way? Do we stop putting our hands up in worship? Do we stop these practices? And no, that's not necessarily it. I think there is, first of all, we have to be honest about it and have these conversations. Then we need to repent of what we have taken and what we can readily acknowledge that it's not ours and it's not, belong to us. But the real key thing, I think, that makes the real difference is not to only be concerned about black music, black songs, black culture, but to be as concerned, if not more concerned, about black liberation. And so it is about having... So one of the reasons why it's kind of so grotesque in many of these environments, you take an environment, I'm going to be direct here. I am in the article, I talk about Bethel and I talk about Hillsong, who both have very obviously taken, black Pentecostal expressions and use them for their own. But as organizations, at least everything I know about them as organizations, have shown no real interest in black liberation. And so what they've done is taken the cultural elements that they like and are inspired by and that feel good to them and generate the kind of responses that they want in their worship environments, but have totally ignored, quite deliberately, the cause of black liberation. And in many other contexts that are similar, the cause of black liberation is actually more than taboo. It's down upon. It's seen as something that's communist or Marxist or left wing or divisive or whatever. And so
DEI, critical race
theory.
theory.
All of that stuff, all of that language. I got blocked by Bill Johnson from Bethel because I said something. He said something about being politically correct once, and I was like, it really sucks to care about people, and he blocked me for that. But because that's what it used to be called, political correctness, and now it's DEI and critical race theory. They're always coming up with a new, bogeyman term for it. But really, it's anything that any kind of language, any kind of practice, any kind of structural change for black liberation gets demonized within those spaces. And so for me, that's like the real evil divorce that's occurred, and that's why it's theft. It's not just being inspired by, because if you're actually inspired by the black music born of suffering, born of the oppressive history in America, you would be concerned for black liberation. And the fact that they're not proves it's theft.
Yeah, I interviewed Malcolm Duplessis a few months back, and we were just talking a little bit about after the murder of George Floyd, he had talked about probably what's going to happen here is you're going to see more African American people on the stages of white churches, but we're not going to care any more deeply about their lives and what they're experiencing. And like you're saying, black liberation. And I think that's what's happened.
Yeah.
Right? We sort of, we take from them, but it serves us more than it serves them.
So, for example, this is a thing that I talk about with anyone who will listen. It has been phenomenal in the last 5 years, maybe a little bit longer, that we have had more black faces in white worship spaces. I think that's good. I do think it's good that, our spaces are less homogenized, that people are seeing representation of themselves on those stages, and that we are seeing more people of color on those stages. That's great. Good. I'm glad. That's a great first step. It is really the first step, though, because what you then have to investigate is who's picking the songs. Is it the black people who are picking, or the people of color who are picking the songs? Who's writing those songs? Are those songs written by people of color? Invariably, they're not. And then you get to the real sources of power. Who is picking who goes on stage? Who is setting the culture, right? So you might have black faces, but how free are those people to say and do everything they want to say and do? And so until you're at the place where there are people of color who are the ones who choose the songs, the ones who write the songs, and most importantly, the ones who pick who goes on stage. Until you get to that point, we have made no progress other than just the aesthetic of it. We have to get to the point where these bigger churches, and really all the churches that exist in this worship world, are more and more handing over the actual reins and the actual power, not just the microphone. Because, anyone who's ever held a microphone in church, which I have many times, thousands of times in my life, know, there are things you can do and there are things you can't do. There are things you can say and there are things you can't say. Some of which is implicit, or much of which is explicit, but we all know that. And until it is black and people of color, black folk and people of color who get to decide what can be said and not said in these supposed multicultural spaces, then we've made no progress.
Why are we so afraid of releasing power and doing what you described?
I mean, this is the history of the human race, and particularly the church. It's, when it comes to power and discussions of power, I'm a heavy Tolkienite, in so much as I really agree with his representation of power and the difficulty in letting go of power, in the metaphor of the ring and the Lord of the Rings. And so in there is, in that story, virtually everyone who encounters the ring finds it very, very difficult to let it go, or impossible. So it is something that plagues us all, but is absolutely, I think, one of the most radical and obvious ways of Jesus Christ, which is in the surrender of power. So Jesus has an enormous, at least for that time and that space, a ministry develops around him of thousands of people literally coming to see him, perform miracles and teach. And he does not shy away from saying very difficult things, very controversial things, from confrontations with religious leaders and political leaders. And that road leads him all the way to Jerusalem, ultimately to the Passion story. And so that is, in my view, the way of Jesus Christ is to surrender power. One of the ways you can do that is to plan at the beginning, like when you get power and influence, to plan to give it away. So, or immediately not think, well, this is me now, I'm set, I've made it, but okay, I'm gonna plan how to get rid of this, I'm gonna plan how to share this, I'm gonna plan how to divest all this influence at every opportunity. That is, I think, the way of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it says, what was that, Philippians? He didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped or taken advantage of or scaled, right? It was made himself less,
but
taking
instead
the form of a servant.
Made himself less, And
it's like he had a choice.
Yeah, and the Philippians 2 there is like really very central in my kind of personal Christology of who I think Jesus is. The servant king, the suffering God. That is, the ways that I think about Jesus that resonate most, and, I consider the way of the cross.
It's part of my observation is we have so much to protect. The bigger that we get, the more fear there is of losing what we have, right? So when you have such a large, let's say, take a mega church, for instance, you've built this massive organization. You have two choices: to sort of say what the people want to hear so they continue giving and you continue scaling. You sort of keep people comfortable, or you speak prophetically to what is actually true and real in the world. And that path is risky because people are going to leave. They may not give as much. And so I think there's this tension between what do I talk about? How honest can I be? How much truth can I actually share?
Yeah.
Or how much am I just trying to protect the institution?
Yeah, I don't think there's any tension there. I don't. It's not a tension. There is a road of fear and a road of faith, and you choose which one you want to go down. And you either believe that it is about the kingdom of God, not about my own institution and my own little empire that I'm creating. And so if you really think that all these people are in God's hands ultimately, that they are his sheep ultimately, that he cares ultimately, and that he will look after them and ultimately do all of that. If you believe that God's going to do that, then to do anything else but speak the truth is just faithless and godless and pointless, is what I think.
I want to read this too, David. You said in your article, black worship has always been political because black life in America has always been political. Singing God Will Make a Way in a storefront church in 1955 Birmingham is not the same as singing it in an air-conditioned megachurch in Orange County while planning your next missions trip to a developing country you can't even locate on a map.
Yeah.
What a sentence. I love that so much. And then you say white charismatic worship took the sound, the feel, the emotional currency of the black church and systematically stripped away its teeth, its urgency, its historical memory. What remains is something slick and marketable and ultimately hollow. And we've kind of talked about that already. But I do want to sort of, and we can work towards landing the plane here, where we go from here. I just imagine some of our listeners may have turned this off already and said, this is heretical, right? Because so many people love Bethel. And I think there's a lot of great people. Like, you can't judge what everybody's heart in all of these spaces, but people that love Bethel or love Hillsong or love the Vineyard, or, you know, we idolize these things. And so to hear this sort of cultural critique is a little disorienting. And so give us some, are there any action steps here of like, how do we take something like this and where do we go with it? What do we do with this?
I mean, I guess I'm referring back to some of the stuff I said before. So acknowledgement is the first step, then repentance, and then you are actively looking to surrender power, surrender white power into the hands of people of color as much as you can do. And that will depend on the context of your church, you know, and, you know, the culture, the structures, and so forth. But one thing I would encourage any leader, worship leader, songwriter who's listening to this to do is to, you know, not just listen to gospel music or Maverick City or whatever and, you know, do what your ancestors did and steal black culture, but also be very aware and present to the causes of black liberation. And so, and the causes of black justice in America. So yeah, you can avoid making the same mistakes, or at least not make them as badly. And so we can progress, we can move on, we can move forward. You know, this is not a condemnation that's saying you've got to stop everything you're doing right now and just give up. But it is saying, you know, you got to do something. You can't just repeat the mistakes from the past.
When was the last time you led worship, David?
It was January of last year's, January 2024 was the last time I led worship. I don't really do it
Okay.
at all these days. I am in the writing space, in the literary world and poetry spaces, and that's kind of where I exist these days.
Do you miss it at all? Or are you happy to be kind of free of it?
I did it for, I guess, 20 years. No, more. Almost 30 years. 29 years. And no, I don't miss it in the slightest. I have a very complicated and nuanced history with it. In terms of my own identity, in terms of my own creativity, in terms of my role within a community, I have a very blessed, privileged, but also complicated, and at points traumatic history with it. And so at this point, I find more, I just think I'm better as a writer than I ever was as a worship leader. So I just prefer to write now.
Yeah. If you were, David, I'm just curious. So much of worship today is find 3 bangers, right? 3 big songs, string them together, and just have this euphoric moment, right? You have 15 minutes, make sure it hits hard. Yeah. If you had free reign, even in a megachurch, say, to plan 15, 20 minutes of congregational singing, congregational worship in an American megachurch today, what are some things that you might do in that time frame that's maybe different than what we're doing now?
I always like to make things smaller. In my writing, I'm always editing, paring down to like the barest minimums. One of the reasons why I love poetry is that, you know, you have just a very small form to work with to say what you want to say. And so my instinct would be to in those environments to make it as personal and intimate and communal as possible, and really concentrate on the human connections that exist through music, and rather seeing it as like some kind of abstract thing, that, you know, this separate thing, this even a transcendent thing that we do to God or for God, is actually something that we share together as if it was bread and wine, and that the music itself was like bread and wine. It's just something we shared together, and something where you can feel it and touch it and experience it a bit more than just, you know, I'm kind of done with big experiences, euphoric experiences, and partly because I don't think the ecstatic worship experience is unique to Christian church. You know, you can recreate that in many different ways, whether that be concerts, sports events. There are many ways to recreate an ecstatic worship experience. Yeah. But there is no way of recreating knowing the story of your neighbor, caring about their story, sharing in each other's pain, having communion with one another. There is no way to recreate that outside of those actual tangible relationships. So I would lean that way.
That's beautiful. It's interesting how a lot of worship music today has kind of been ripped off of. U2 and Coldplay are sort of the easy targets. Like, we've sort of taken that aesthetic and brought it into the church. Do you have a similar critique of bands like U2 and Coldplay? Are they just doing a similar thing, just kind of on a global
in terms of stealing
stage?
Black music, you mean?
I
think it goes back a generation or two before them. So if you're going to look at the history of music, so really in the 60s, what happens is there's blues music, right, that is, you know, come out of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and is still going like even into the 60s. And what happens is the Rolling Stones, and particularly Led Zeppelin, take rhythm and blues music and whitewash it into something that is more pop rock, right? And so from that point, and then you get Black Sabbath, who kind of do the similar thing, but they take that to metal, and it's the birth of metal. But really, the guitarists and the songs that the Stones and Led Zeppelin are all influenced by are Muddy Waters and, you know, B.B. King and, you know, blues legends. Yeah. And so that's where that was the theft, right? And so then when U2 get hold of the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin, and you can even include the Beatles to some degree with Little Richard and, you know, Chuck Berry, and, you know, there was always taking more of the popular stuff rather than the blues. You know, the Beatles weren't particularly bluesy, whereas the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin were. And so, you know, that the theft was there in the 60s, and then by the time U2 come around in the late 70s, it's kind of like already a white thing, and by the time Coldplay come around at the end of the 90s, you know, it's white music at that point, you know. So, yeah. So, yes, but like their generations. And you could say that now. You could say that if there's a 20-year-old worship leader that's coming up now, you know, and is influenced by the stuff that happened in the early 2000s and the 90s, they are just as innocent in terms of they're not actively stealing. They're just recreating within the culture that was given to them as a child. But that doesn't mean that the theft didn't happen. Like, it doesn't mean that it's not happening again and again each time we appropriate a new part of the Black culture.
Yeah, at least I've seen, even in my own life as I reflect, we, at least in the evangelical world, don't really value history. Mm-hmm. And again, I know we're kind of rehashing some of the same things, but it's like the power of just right now, what God is doing right now, but we fail to recognize how we got here. Yeah. And I think that's a big part of what I'm pulling away from this discussion is, and I'm reading more than I've ever read, just reading history and just diving in to get a better understanding of the church and who we are and all that. So, David, thank you for your time today. and just appreciate your honesty and boldness for just getting to the root
Yeah.
of something that's really hard for us to kind of talk about. I think a lot of people just don't want to talk about it because it's easier just to keep going and kind of basking in our privilege.
Yeah.
That's the easy route.
I mean, I don't want to talk about it. I mean, but partly because I'm not black and I was not born, and my history is not the black church, and so, you know, even when you ask me to come on, I'm like, I don't know, like I kind of, I'm not an expert in these things. This is not, I'm not talking about my culture in terms of the black church, obviously, but what I am talking about is how the white church steals, and I do know about that, and so like that is something we can be honest about is our culture and where that culture comes from.
Yeah. And I'm trying to have some conversations too. I've brought on some other leaders and artists in black spaces,
Great.
which is important. But I also think, and I don't know, I'm open to feedback from some African American people who listen. But two white guys kind of diving into something like this, I don't know if they appreciate that or if it feels like some sort of posturing. I don't know. I'm open to feedback. But it seems to me that would be maybe appreciated in some way.
I certainly think that we can't rely on the black church to tell us everything we've done wrong. We have to talk about it ourselves, and we have to come to some of those conclusions ourselves and take responsibility for it ourselves and talk to each other about it ourselves, and not just rely on black church historians to school us the entire time. We have to do the work ourselves.
Yeah. David, talk to us about your upcoming book that's releasing later this year.
Yeah.
A Rebellion of Care.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
So I've got a book coming out on July 15th with Convergent, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And it's going to be everywhere you get your books. I would prefer it if you got it from an independent bookstore. Your local independent bookstore would be ideal for me, but you can get it everywhere. And it's a book of poems and essays. Really, so in the last 5-10 years, as I've kind of worked through both my spiritual beliefs, my relationship with religious institutions, and my relationship to political institutions, which are crumbling around us as we speak, I have really tried to hone in on what do I think is important? What do I want to concentrate on? What is my value system? And really, I boiled it down to a rebellion of care, which is that we are to care about ourselves, our own bodies, our own mental health. We're meant to care about our neighbors. We're meant to care about our friends. That friendship is really the way that anything good is going to happen, is going to be born out of friendship, and that kind of those loyal, long-lasting, heavily invested relationships, rather than the family unit. It's going to be friendships that really change the world. And so that, and also how we look after the earth, how we care for the environment, how our personal interactions with the food we eat and the spaces we live in, like all of that, I boil down to we have to care. That's what's important, is we have to care for the world we've been given, the lives we've been given, the bodies we've been given, the communities we're a part of, and help build them to be more caring places, and to make sure our religious and political views and actions bring more care to people and do less harm. So that was kind of general idea behind the book, but it's just full of, I think about 150 poems and then a bunch of essays in there too, which delve on a lot of those subjects. So I'm really happy with it. But it's a funny thing now because people are just starting to read it. There's early release copies out in the world, and so I'm just starting to get feedback back, and people endorsing it, and so it's that tentative excitement, nervousness, massive vulnerability phase for me right now. So, but
is it different for you because you've released music in the past? Is this a different feeling than releasing a record?
Better. Yeah, it's way better. I tell you why, because I released an album. My last album I released was in 2016, and it was so depressing that I'd worked on this thing for a year, and then I released it on a Friday, as we do these days. I released it on a Friday, and social media and all that stuff, and a bunch of people on that Friday was like, oh, awesome, so good, I'm so amazing, you know. And then a little bit into Saturday, and then by Tuesday, it was basically forgotten. And, you know, like everyone had moved on, and like it was like so depressing. It was. So, I was probably one of the lowest moments of my life. You feel like you've poured yourself out into this thing, and just the way that music sits in our culture right now is very disposable, and it just comes and goes, and you know, like it's very transient, and I don't enjoy that. Like I enjoy the connection with the individual, and I'm finding that writing is creating more long-lasting, more engaged interaction and connection with individuals, and having far more of an impact as well. Especially now, as you can listen to any music you want at any time, at any point, it's all in your pocket. It's like the way of making music and selling music is just not something I really want to be a part of at the moment. I don't find it creatively, emotionally, spiritually fulfilling.
Yeah.
So I still love music and still, you know, devote enormous amounts of time to finding new music that I love. But for me to actually be a part of it is, I don't know if I could do it.
Part of it might be, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you've sort of broadened your audience to be not just the church people. And I think there's a certain energy that probably comes from interacting with people of different faiths and backgrounds and perspectives, and learning how to love humanity and all of its diversity, you know, rather than just trying to reach a certain subset that's focused on one thing, you know.
For sure.
So
I still love music, but I'm very pessimistic about the industry.
yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. I am too. Yeah. And so this has been refreshing, man. David, thanks for your time today, man. Looking forward for people to hear this. And so what's your website? So you have, okay, go to David's Instagram. Make sure you're following him, David Gate Poet. You have a Substack,
Also,
which you got to subscribe to.
Also David Gate Poet. I do some free stuff on there, but it's mainly a subscription too. And then if you want to buy any of my prints or any of the poems, stickers and all that stuff is on davidgatepoet.com. And then the book comes out in July, so be on the lookout for that.
Amazing. Thanks, man. Appreciate you.
Thank you.